Hey guys, this is another video where I am documenting my research process and attempting to teach it to you so that I can learn the material better and you can also benefit in the process. So in this video, we're going to go through the top units in the game, primarily starting with the 4-cost carries. We're going to talk about how to itemize those carries and then reverse engineer the best 1, 2, and 3-cost units that can hold those best in slot items basically for those 4 costs, and then create a tier list of 1, 2, 3 cost units in order to figure out how do you play a strong early mid game so that you can transition into the strongest 4 cost late game. This analysis will not really include how to itemize rerolls. So for example, Blaster reroll with Ezreal Hui, Honey reroll with Ziggs, Hecarim reroll, multi-striker reroll. We're not going to go into those though, because those are all going to be strong carries. They will be factored into the analysis, and I'll factor that into the tier list at the end. But the primary purpose of this analysis is playing around 4 costs. So with that said, let's get started. So for 4 costs carries, and I'm ignoring the tanks here, though I will include the tanks in the end 4 cost unit tier list. But as a starting point, we're just going to start with the 4 cost carries. So we have Kalista first off. Fairy and multi-striker are both very strong right now. Kalista is the best carry in the game right now. And next behind that, we have Karma and Ryze, who both benefit a lot from being able to spread anti-heal really well. And then Olaf. Olaf is significantly better than Fiora right now in the stats. Keep in mind that all of this data is based off of, I believe I filtered by GM plus. So we have Fiora, Nami, and Varus at the B tier, and then Gwen at the C tier. So one thing you'll notice with Karma and Ryze is that they're both going to play typically around a Preserver core, though Ryze you can play with Portal, you can play with Arcana, so it's a little bit more flexible. Karma you're typically going to play with Preserver, and Olaf actually pairs pretty well with Karma because in the mid game, or in stage 4, if you can get a 4 chrono setup with Karma, Zillion, Jax, and Vex, which later on you want to be able to upgrade into Camille. Olaf has, in his ability, during his active, has crowd control immunity. And because his mana is 50, he'll usually be, and since that active, the crowd control immunity lasts for 5 seconds, he'll usually be in that crowd control state. And during the 4 chrono freeze time, he actually benefits from that, so he can continue attacking, which is why he's also better than Fiora when paired with Karma. And then late game, when you're playing Karma with Fiora or Olaf, you want to cap out with Briar or Camille. So these are kind of like your stage 4, 5 holders of your melee items, and then towards the end game you want to cap out with the 5 costs. So we're going to really go through just the S and A tier, since that's what you typically want to be playing towards. And well, we'll include the analysis for all of the 4 costs, but we want to focus on these 4 to figure out what are the best items for these units, and then kind of reverse engineer. And Meta TFT has a bunch of great stats based off of stage and item, where we can go into the items and look at what are the best item holders for those in the early mid game. So we're going to start off with all of the 4 costs that we just went over in this tier list. These are the 4 cost carries and their best items. So for the most part on the left side here, up until Fiora, I have what is the most kind of built three 3 item builds, or that are like some combination of the most common and highest average placement, with a and so there are gonna be combinations that are higher average placing, but sample size might be low, or it might rely on artifact. So these are like kind of just the most generic, most common builds. And then down here for Nami, Varus, Gwen, I didn't really do that same thing. Like Gwen, for example, you can see just can work with a ton of items, but she's the worst 4-cost carry, so you just kind of throw whatever in on her at the end. Kalista is pretty much really good with double Rage Blade and the Queen's Crown, though it can be good with Pyro Emblem, Last Whisper, Red Buff. But nowadays, Kalista is played with 5+ Fairy, which means that you're gonna put the Queen's Armor on Rakan usually. And so when you get double Rage Blade, Rakan can just... the Queen's Armor allows your Queen's Crown holder to heal the Rakan. So if this Kalista can start scaling a ton with the double Rage Blade, then he'll start healing the Crown holder an insane amount. So then the strategy or your win condition is similar to like a Cassiopeia reroll, or from last set Tom Kench and Bard reroll, where that double Rage Blade starts to scale like crazy, and then you get insane healing on your frontline armor holder, and then your frontline can't be taken down, and then Kalista eventually just wipes out the enemy team with that infinite scaling. So that's the game plan with Kalista. With Karma, you usually want some mana gen item, blue buff being the best. Adaptive can be used. Shojin is really not good. Shojin in general is just very underwhelming at the moment. By the way, I put on the right side here items that can be used for these units, but that are significantly worse than the items on the left side in the stats. So you want some type of mana gen item, because Karma's mana is 30, and every time she casts, she will spread a rift to the closest unaffected enemy, which means if you have either red buff or Morello on her, then she's basically an amazing spreader of burn and anti-heal. Red buff is significantly better than Morello, because you just want the attack speed. That 35% attack speed is more valuable than the additional 25 AP, because you're getting a lot of the damage through the burn, and especially if you can get Witchcraft emblem on her, then she's also spreading the Witchcraft curse across the board, which is why this combination of items is extremely strong. Blinding Jewel is really good because, and we talked about these in the artifact video that I put out recently, so I won't go into detail. And these are more generic items that are good, and you can notice that there's a pattern. Like GS, Gunblade are good on both Kalista and Karma, good on Ryze as well, though for the most part for both of these items they're very generic, but healing isn't very good in the early game since you're not dealing that much damage. Giant Slayer isn't very good in the early game because there aren't that many units that have more than the 1750 max health threshold. So you usually only want to build them in the late game. Next we have Ryze. Ryze is great at scaling with Archangel, because with the portal, especially if you're going vertical portal, you want to have a strong front line with Taric, and the portal itself with its support and damage can help your team survive. It can throw out healing, attack speed, etc. And so the way you win the fight is you just outscale your opponent. And the way you do that is with Archangel Staff. Ryze is also amazing at spreading anti-heal and burn with red buff. You don't really want Morello because, again, you want attack speed on Ryze, because with Scholar, every time he attacks, he gains mana. So that's another reason that you prefer attack speed over mana generation items. Mana generation items don't do well at all for Ryze. And you can see that his portal, runic portal, fires 12 magic bolts split amongst the 3 closest enemies. So this red buff can spread really well. And then JG, especially as your Archangel Staff scales, this JG gets really strong as you get more AP, and that crit, because he's firing so many bolts. And someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that the crit is calculated per bolt, and because there are 12 bolts, like you're more likely to have a like more average damage than if, for example, it only fired one high damage bolt that has higher variance whether it crits or not. So if you know how that works, please leave a comment so that the rest of us can confirm that. Rabadon's really good just because you deal way more damage. Hex Gunblade works well because it kind of sticks with the game plan of sustain. And you'll notice that the overall game plan for Kalista, Karma, and Ryze is you're hoping to out-sustain the enemy. Karma and Ryze, you're either playing with Vertical Portal, which you want to outlast the opponent, or Preserver, which Preserver is built around healing, so you want to outlast the enemy. Karma also with Preserver, you want to outlast the enemy. And so that's why Gunblade can be quite good, because it helps with the game plan of scaling. So if you have like Archangel and Hexa Gunblade, you're scaling with this, and this Gunblade keeps your front line alive. Same thing with Zhonya's, like you just want to last longer. And Static Shiv is also quite good because Ryze is hitting so many backline units, and he also benefits from the attack speed and ability power. It's just very general purpose. Next we have Olaf. Olaf, you just want your melee carry items, which is quite similar to Fiora. Although Fiora benefits a little bit more from specific artifacts. And I won't go into detail since I already kind of talked about that in the artifacts video. Surprisingly, Runon's Hurricane is quite good, and I actually filtered out category 5 in the stats, and it still showed up quite strong. I suspect it's because the 20 magic resist, particularly in a meta where you have Karma and Ryze being strong, that 20 magic resist could make a big difference in keeping him alive. And it has just good stats with the 25 AD, 10% attack speed. And if he gets stuck on a tank, that additional bolt at the nearby enemy can be really helpful in taking down backliner. GS is really good on Olaf because, again, you don't want him to get stuck on a super tank, so that helps him take that down. Titans isn't as great on Olaf, but can be good when you pair it with Edge of Night, since sometimes Olaf could just get taken down pretty quickly if he's first or second targeted by one of the enemy backline carries and not be able to get to full stack. So having Edge of Night with Titans just makes sure that he can get to that full stacks. So I won't go into all of these. Fiora, for the most part, Olaf and Fiora are quite interchangeable, and you're usually playing them in conjunction with Karma, because with Karma you're playing around Preservers, you're playing with Zillion, Rakan, Bard, but specifically Zillion, because Zillion gives you Frost. With Olaf you could just throw in Twitch, and then with Fiora you're usually playing Fiora Gwen, and if you can find the Morgana that Preserver Witchcraft ties in with Fiora, though it's usually harder to find a Morgana in stage 4. So that again is why Olaf is usually easier to hit because Fiora is just more contested right now, and Olaf just performs better in the stats. And again, with 4 Chrono, Olaf is superior to Fiora. Nami is just good general purpose. She doesn't really have a great fit in the game right now, other than with Ryze. Usually you're playing Nami with Ryze either in Vertical Portal or in Arcana Ryze, mainly because with Ryze you can play was it Galio and Nora, who are both portals to get the 3 portal, and they're both mages, so Nami's great to pair with those and sticks with the game plan because every 3rd cast she summons the Leviathan, which stuns like a bunch of enemies, which sticks with the game plan of Ryze, especially if you have Archangel Staff to just buy Ryze more time so that he can deal more damage. Varus isn't great right now in the stats. He's particularly good with Frost Emblem. You want red buff because he splashes like so many units, so red buff is extremely strong. He hits adjacent, explodes into a cluster of fireballs to all other enemies within 3 hexes. So red buff is just amazing because you want the attack speed, and he hits so many units. And then Gwen we kind of already talked about. So we're gonna next focus on the core items for each of these primary carries, which I have listed on the left side, and then go into what are the best item holders. So for Kalista, we have Guinsoo's Rageblade, and I have this broken down by 1, 2, 3 costs, and then kind of backup units that can hold them, or if you happen to find an early 5 cost. This is based off of Meta TFT's per stage stats by item. And so you can see Ashe is very good, especially if you have double Rageblade. Ashe with multi is really strong because it triggers extra attacks. And if you happen to go like Last Whisper, then Ashe can be really good because she's an AD carry. Zoe is not as great if you also have additional melee or AD items, but because Zoe is a scholar and she gets mana on attack, if you have a Rageblade and throw in like an Ahri with Zoe, you have like a Zoe 2 with an Ahri, that can be extremely strong to carry your early game. And one thing to keep in mind, anytime you build Rageblade, you want to have basically just Rageblade in the early game, and your second item ideally would be tank items, and maybe even your 3rd item would be tank items, because the way you want to win, your win condition for fights is just to outscale the enemy team, which means you need a strong front line. So we have Namzi and Twitch, which are both solid Guinsoo holders. They're not amazing, but they can be quite strong just because they're safe. They're in the back line with AD. Warwick is actually really good if you can, and you can also throw in like BT or QSS, because Kalista in the later game will usually be paired with like a Hecarim Katarina, and so if you have some melee items, then you can move those over to Hecarim or Katarina later. Jax also quite strong with multi-striker. For the most part, you only want to play these with Rageblade if you have a 2-star, because at the very least you need your unit to survive, especially for the frontliners. It's a lot safer to play Rageblade on backliner because they're just safer and not going to take aggro right away. Seraphine can be strong, especially if you have an early 3 fairy with Seraphine, Lilia, and Tristana, because the crown can stack up and give you more damage quickly. So that's also why Tristana is strong. Tristana is probably the best 2-cost carry, or just early game carry in general for Rageblade. And the reason for that is because you are able to then hold the fairy units. You already want to play towards fairy with Kalista, and just gives you the most seamless transition in stage 4 because you're already holding the core units. Cassiopeia is quite strong if you can get an early cast 2. Her abilities just scales with attack speed because the faster you attack, then the next 3 attacks deal more magic damage. She can do her Witch Fang more. And if you go Cassiopeia, if you happen to hit an early cast, you could, if you hit a lot of casts, then you could just straight up go Cassiopeia reroll with Shapeshifters. Or you can transition into Kalista later. Kog'Maw is one of the strongest units in stage 3, and you could still go Kog'Maw reroll this, but it's without Tristana. You're going for a 4 Hunter version instead. Rageblade isn't necessarily his best item, though he can be a very solid item holder for Kalista. Kassadin with Rageblade is very strong. He can start attacking faster. He takes aggro, he shields himself, and as he attacks faster and faster, he can cast more, get more shield, and deal a lot of damage. So, and his attacks get stacking magic damage, so those Rage Blades, it just scales really well for Kassadin. So Kassadin is very strong holder for Kalista, and because you already have multi-striker, it again is similar to Tristana, is very natural to be able to transition more seamlessly than, for example, if you have a Cassiopeia or a Kog'Maw, that transition is going to be a little bit tougher when you're looking to do your big roll down on 4-2. Next, at the 3 cost, we have Jinx and Ezreal. Neither of these are that strong. Like Jinx has been nerfed to the ground. If you happen to have a Jinx, like Jinx 1 in stage 2 with the Rage Blade, like that can do decent, but it's usually not worth playing around. Ezreal can be quite strong. Rage Blade is definitely not his best item, but if you happen to have an early Rage Blade with an Ezreal and 3 Portal, 3 Portal early game is just strong in general, so it can actually do decent. And then when you're doing your roll down on 4-2, these are okay item holders. Like Ryze is probably the best out of these 3. Like Karma really isn't that great with Rage Blade. It's not amazing on Ryze either, but if when you do your roll down, this is what you hit, and you don't find any Kalistas, or you're 3-way contested for Kalista and you're not finding anything, these are options. Smolder is actually a great hit if you find him in stage 4. Smolder 1, if you have a strong front line, you throw in like a Rumble with some, like a Tom Kench or something for a front line to get 2 Blaster in. That can actually hold you down until later when you have a little bit more gold to roll down for Kalista again. And then Milio, if you happen to find early, though, usually you want to save the Rage Blade for Kalista, but because now you have the item remover every creep round, if you happen to hit that early Milio and you don't find the Kalista, it's actually not bad because he can then be able to get your whole team items, especially if, again, you have a strong front line. So these are all the item holders for Kalista. Next, we're going to go into Karma. And before I dive into Karma's units, what we're going to do is go through each of these I'm just going to go through Kalista, Karma, Ryze, Olaf. And then we're going to look at patterns of which units appear across these item holders. So for example, you'll see Zoe appears for both Kalista and Karma. And that will then inform us on what are the best units in general to be holding in stage 2 and 3. So Karma, you really want mana gen, which is blue buff. Usually adaptive can be used as well, and red buff, though Morello can be used as well, and we talked about why earlier. In the early game, Ziggs is extremely strong with Karma's items and spreads that red buff pretty well because his bomb hits nearby enemies as well. Twitch, surprisingly, and I have not played Twitch as an item holder for Karma at all, But Twitch surprisingly is really good with these items, um, in large part because blue buff, and keep in mind for blue buff, all of these units are going to have low mana requirements because blue buff reduces your max mana by 10 and then allows them to deal more damage when they get a takedown. So Ziggs has 40 mana, will cause him to have his mana reduced to 30. Twitch has mana 35, and so he'll be able to cast pretty often. And with red buff, he'll be able to, and his ability pierces through all the units, and so you want to position Twitch opposite side enemy carry, but he can apply the red buff really well and deal a lot of damage with this blue buff. And Zoe is an amazing blue buff holder as well, especially because her ability reduces magic resist, and so she keeps on hitting the same enemy. Their magic resist goes down by a lot, and then eventually can kill like their tank pretty quickly. Zoe, so I put red buff on the units whose abilities have AoE and can apply the red buff pretty well. I did not put a red buff on Zoe because Zoe only is single target. So generally you would prefer to have item holders, especially if you just have a blue buff, then you could just stick it with the single target. But ideally, if you have blue buff and red buff or Morello, then you prefer the units that can apply the Morello or the red buff to multiple units. At the 2 costs, we have Zilean and Ahri. Zilean hits with a bomb and hits adjacent units. So keep in mind that anytime you're playing like red buff on units that hit multiple enemies, you want to make sure you position like your Zilean, for example, to target the enemy. So for example, if the enemy has 3 units in the front line in the middle, if you corner your Zilean and he hits like, let's say the enemy's Zilean's in the corner and you hit the Zoe here, it's only going to hit these 2. But if you position your Zilean in the middle, then it'll hit the Twitch and Zoe Ziggs. So for the most part, it's just safer to put Zilean in the middle. But again, that's matchup dependent. Ahri isn't a great unit since she was nerfed, but her ability will launch 3 Firefoxes at enemies near the target. So she gains an additional Foxfire every time she casts. So she is actually quite good at spreading this red buff as well. Hui also spreads every 3rd cast, paints 2 extra bolts on the lowest percentage health enemies, which is very strong with red buff. Also has 40 mana. Zilean has 70 mana, so his mana is not as great, but he's just a very strong unit. And Zilean, you want to play Zilean with Preservers in Karma anyway late game because he has Chrono and Preserver. So Zilean, similar to what we talked about with Tristana and Kassadin being really easy transitions toward Kalista, Zilean is a very easy transition towards Karma, though you do need to make sure that you have that item remover available to move the items the moment you hit your Karma. Veigar is good with blue buff, but Veigar again was nerfed to the ground. He's mainly strong if you can get to Veigar 3 and you've been buying a lot of charms. So for the most part, I would avoid Veigar unless you just happen to get like a Veigar 2 from Orb or something. He's not that great. And then at 4 costs, you can use these as item holders. Blue buff is not great on Ryze. It's like okay on Gwen and Nami. And then Milio can be used to give your team a bunch of items. Next we have Ryze. Ryze, you want Archangels and red buff. So Archangels, you want to have scaling. So similar to Kalista, you want to make sure that your front line is very strong if you have Archangels slammed. So if that's your first item, usually your second and third item, you want to just have be tank items because that's how you're going to win the fight in the early mid game and later in the late game. So with red buff, you want to make sure ideally that whoever you're giving the item to has AoE on their ability so that they can spread the red buff better. Seraphine is strong. She hits AoE, especially if you can get 3 mage in, then the red buff and the Archangel, she could deal a lot of damage. Ziggs, we already talked about with Karma, is quite strong with red buff and can deal a lot of damage with that scaling Archangel. And Blitzcrank in Blitz 2 in the early game, if you can get like a Warmogs or Stoneplate, is one of the best tanks in the game. So frontline wise, you're in a really great position. Lilia can hold Archangels, though I think this is kind of skewed by high horsepower. But because her healing scales and damage scales, she can, if she has enough time, she can actually carry for you, though I suspect this is primarily stage 2. If you get early Lily 2, maybe a Poppy 2 as well, that can kind of soak up some damage while Lilia scales. Soraka surprisingly can do well because she heals, also deals damage to adjacent enemies, so that's where the red buff can be good. And similar to Zillion, you want to make sure you consider that when you're positioning her. Zoe again does not apply red buff very well, but the Archangels can work well and naturally transitions from Zoe to Ryze. And Zoe with 3 portal early game, like she can carry you all the way to stage 4. At the 2 cost, there's actually a lot of options available. I won't go into specific detail on all of them. Ahri just kind of naturally makes sense because you're already playing, usually you're playing portal early game. And so if you already have Zoe, then adding in Ahri for Scholar makes sense. Also, if you had a Zoe 2 early, you might be playing around Zoe 2, and then you throw in Ahri for Scholar, and then if you happen to hit Ahri 2, then you could just use the item remover to move the items over to Ahri. Bard can be quite good, and similar to Zillion and Bard, you can play Ryze with either vertical portal or with preservers. And if you're playing down the preserver path, then you're already holding these units, and they can just hold the items that are good on Ryze. So anytime you can hold the units that you want to play with your endgame carry, it's just a lot more gold efficient and makes your roll down a lot simpler. We talked about Hui being good with applying red buff, and similarly Ezreal is very good at applying red buff. And the Archangel staff is actually, it's not great, but I wouldn't say it's horrible on Ezreal because he actually has some AP scaling in his kit, and so you would obviously prefer like Bard or Hui at the 3 cost level. But if you happen to get Ezreal and you're already playing Portal and you get like an Ezreal 2 by like 3-5 or something, you might as well just move the items from Zoe over to Ezreal. Swain is actually quite good as well because he deals damage and scales his HP gain with Archangel. So usually you would want like if you happen to for some reason have like a Shyvana 2 and like a Nico 2 or like Aura Nico 2 that can with like a stone plate or something, and then you can stick Swain behind them, he can actually carry a fight. And then finally we have our 4 costs. All of these can actually carry red buff all right. Nami and Karma is obviously preferred over Gwen since Gwen takes aggro, but Archangels isn't great on Karma. It's like okay on Nami, and it's solid on Gwen if you can have her be at a 2-star level and have a very strong front line. So that's Ryze. Next we have Olaf and Fiora, which basically hold the same items, BT, Starex, and you can see that there's a ton of units that can hold BT, and then fewer units that can also hold Starex well, since Starex mainly benefits AD units. At the 1 cost level, the best holders are Warwick, Jace, and Poppy. Warwick makes a lot of sense if you're already skewing towards kind of a Frost Olaf direction, since you're probably going to be playing like Zillion, which you want to lean towards for Preserver as well. If you happen to get a Frost emblem, then you can go vertical Frost. And if you happen to get that Warwick too early, then his passive scales attack speed and movement speed for each champion killed. So if you happen to get that early, it actually works out pretty well. Jace is just a very strong early game unit. If you have 3 portal in, throw in a shapeshifter, he can carry fights. Poppy, if you are going witchcraft in early game, 4 witchcraft can actually be quite strong. And then if for some reason you get a witchcraft emblem, then you could go vertical witchcraft, which leads into Fiora pretty well. And then you have a bunch of 1 costs here. BT can actually just be used as like a frontline tank item if you have a 2-star tank, since it gives a % max health shield and also magic resist. So if you just have a sword and cloak lying around, let's say you're win streaking, it's not a bad slam. Neela and Akali are both decent holders, though neither of them are very strong. Akali is quite good from a trait bot standpoint since her traits are pretty insane, but from a just straight up unit perspective, she can just jump in and die. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend her, although if you happen to hit an early Akali too, like, you can go for it. Neela's going to be a little bit safer, though Neela, her traits aren't great. Like, unless you're kind of going like 4 warrior with Eldritch perhaps. I've played some of it, but it's not amazing, but it's okay. Hecarim is like the premier holder for BT Sterak's, especially if you can get this by like 3-5. You could consider re-rolling Hecarim, or you can just use it to carry into stage 4. And these other 3 costs are like not as good. You could frontline Ezreal. If you happen to get Ezreal too, you could frontline Ezreal and let him take aggro. He'll jump back and then heal up, and that way he's casting faster. But that's like kind of not your usual use case. And then down here, eventually, even if you hit your Olaf and Fiora 2, if you can get to level 9, and then if somehow you are able to find a Briar or Camille 2, that's how you cap out. But even on your roll down in stage 4, if you happen to just find a Briar 1 or Camille 1 on like 4-2, and you're not really hitting your Olafs or Fioras, they could definitely hold down the fort until like late stage 4. So now that we've gone over the S and A tier units and what items they hold, we're gonna look through on a cost basis. So this is all the 1 costs, given how frequently they appear as an item holder for these S tier 4 costs. How much you want to prioritize holding these units. And it's also dependent on what item components you have. So for example, if you have BT Sterak's, then holding like, I don't know, Twitch, I guess. Well, so the funny thing is, like, if you have BT Sterak's, you can hold Jace or Warwick, which also means why you would want to hold Zoe and Twitch, because then you could get Portal or Frost. So part of it is to consider what item components you have, which would then lean you towards these directions. But we saw Zoe can be an item holder for either Ryze or Karma. Twitch can be an item holder for Kalista with Rageblade, or Karma with blue buff, red buff. Jace is just really strong with BT Sterak's for Olaf or Fiora. Lilia is strong because you want her in Fairy. So with Seraphine or Tristana is really strong. So for Tristana, you want the Rageblade, so you can play down the Kalista line. And if you happen to get an early Lilia too, you can also just put Archangel on her or BT on her, and that will lean towards like a Ryze Preserver line. Well, typically you don't want BT if you're playing Ryze, but you could play Archangel and just put like tank items on her, since you'll want tank items for Ryze later as well. Blitzcrank is just strong because if you compare him with Ziggs we saw can be used for both Ryze and for Karma. So these are like gonna be your S tier 1 costs, and I would recommend holding them every game, unless you already know from an item component standpoint, like you're leaning heavily in one direction. Seraphine was very good. Could be a Rageblade holder. Good with Fairy, since Fairy is so strong. Warwick, we discussed, can be really strong with Rageblade as well. Can also hold BT Sterax. Actually, given that, I might even consider moving Warwick up to S tier. Ashe and Jax can be good for Rageblade and for multi-striker angle. Nomsy himself can hold Rageblade, but because Twitch can also hold blue buff, red buff, and Frost is just a much stronger early game, I would see Nomsy more of a trait bot for Twitch. So if you happen to hit the Nomsy 2 over the Twitch 2 quicker, then you can just carry Nomsy. Poppy is mainly good because she can pair with Lilia and Zoe really well. She can hold the BT Sterax, but she's like okay. And Elise and Soraka are just like kind of bleh units. Next we have 2 costs. Tristana is like the premier mid-game, like stage 3 Rageblade holder, and transitions really naturally into Kalista. Kassadin, same thing. Really great rate. Kassadin actually can hold all of the items. Can hold Rageblade, can hold BT, can hold melee units or like even AP units, since he's a melee AP. So you can hold like Rabadons or Crown Guard. You can hold tank items. So Kassadin's just amazing multi-purpose unit and has amazing traits with Portal and Multi-Striker. Can even hold like Archangels for Ryze. Rumble we have here mainly because Rumble's hero augment is like one of the few hero augments in the game that are still worth playing, and can go down a Blaster Vanguard reroll path. This is kind of just separate from the analysis that we're doing. Zillion, solid item holder for Karma and Ryze, and you want the Preserver in the late game. Frost is very good early, and then Galio Portal is just very strong in the early game. We saw with Jace and Zoe being really strong. Same thing with Kassadin. Like if you can get 3 Portal in early game, and because you have so many possible item holders across Kassadin, Jace, and Zoe, it's just a really strong opener. Cassiopeia, if you have a Rageblade and like an early Cassiopeia pair, she can be really strong if you can do a 3-2 roll down, hit your Cassiopeia 2, and you're in a pretty good place going into stage 4. And Shyvana kind of paired with Cassiopeia, since you're usually playing shapeshifters. With Cassiopeia, you could go Cassiopeia reroll with shapeshifters if you happen to hit a bunch of them. And Shyvana with the AoE stun is really good, again, because with Rageblade you just want more time. And if you have a Shyvana 2, a Cassiopeia 2, you have like 1 or 2 tank items on Shyvana with a Rageblade with Cassiopeia in the back, that's really strong. Next we have Nunu. Nunu is just going to be your best third Honeymancy with Blitz and Ziggs, who we discussed were S tier in the 1 cost. So he's really strong. And then Kog'Maw, we haven't really seen Kog'Maw that strong as an item holder in all of the stuff that we talked about. But in the stats in stage 3, Kog'Maw is quite strong, and you can still play Kog'Maw reroll. So that's why I have Kog'Maw here, though Kog'Maw is not amazing if you're playing towards 4 costs. At the B tier, we have Akali. As a pure standalone unit, ignoring her traits, I'd actually put Akali lower. But from a pure like trait standpoint, Akali can be quite good, because if you have BT Sterax, Warrior can be strong. If you have like an early Katarina, that Warrior is strong. Or if you're playing like with Rageblade, Ashe, or Kassadin or Jax, you just want that third multi-striker. Akali is there for you. Ahri as a unit is not great. We did talk about how she can use Karma items quite well, or Ryze. So she can be decent if you happen to have the like right setup, but she's not going to be as general purpose good. Neela can hold the BT Sterex for Olaf Fiora, but she's just not very good. Like, can be okay, I guess, as an item holder early, but not strong. Syndra's just a shit unit. She got nerfed to the ground. At the 3 costs, we have Hecarim is like the premier BT Sterex holder. You want to be playing Hecarim when you're going down the Kalista route, and he can just be a good secondary carry, and can transition you into Olaf Fiora later. Ezreal and Hui are here. Hui, we saw, can be good Karma and Ryze holders. And Ezreal here is just because Blaster reroll is like one of the best comps in the game if you can hit. And the hard part is hitting. And so I have them here as well. Bard can be a good item holder for Karma and Ryze, and Preserver is just very strong. Katarina, Fairy is very strong, and you can hold like BT with the Crown guard on her is quite good in the mid game. And then Nico is just general purpose, kind of like a trait bot, can actually hold like your tank items really well in the mid game. And if you're playing down towards Karma or Ryze from a Preserver standpoint, you throw in 2 Shapeshifter, and especially if you can find that early Morgana, you get that 2 Witchcraft, and she can help you hold down the fort, especially if you have a Rage Blade stemmed. Or if you are playing like Archangels, or you have like Karma, blue buff, red buff, and you just want time to spread all of those rifts for Karma, Nico can be a solid mid-game tank. And then the rest of these 3 costs are just like kind of meh, not great. And then finally, I've added the tanks into the 4 costs. So Rakan is, because Kalista is so strong, Rakan, if you want to play towards 5 Fairy, get that Fairy armor. So Rakan's going to be your best tank in the game paired with Kalista. Tahm Kench is very strong because you get that CC effect. A lot of times you might be playing, you could play Arcana with Ryze. If you're playing Hecarim, you throw in that Tahm Kench, you get a lot of value. And then Karma, Ryze, Olaf here. Taric is like okay in the stats. You're mainly playing Taric if you're already playing like Ryze. If you're playing like Preservers, even with Karma, you could just throw in like Taric and another Bastion if you happen to hit a Taric too, instead of like Shapeshifters. And then lastly, we have Nasus. Nasus, I believe, has been nerfed a bunch. So he's going to be your weakest tank. And Nasus, like even if you hit a Nasus 2, if you don't have tank items on Nasus, he's just not going to be very good. So that covers all of the top tier units. And hopefully this analysis will help you understand what items you can slam in the early game, you know, to play towards this end game, and go through the unit tiers on who can best hold them at each cost, and be able to finish with your end game board at the 4 cost level. So I hope this video was helpful. If you enjoyed this video, please let me know in the comments. And if you have ideas on what other research you would like me to do that you think would be helpful, both for yourself and for others, please let me know and I'll take them into consideration. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.